The problem it faces is that its fundamental job is to report and to be believed. And if it gets into the business of calling particular groups by a particular name, it may not be believed in those places you most want it to be believed. And also, what is terrorism? Is, for example, what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghurs terrorism? I would certainly say that. What is happening in the Burma's government is to the people there. Where do you stop? It's very difficult. We're in the middle of a propaganda war here, and there are suffering on every side. And understandably, all those sides want their case put forward in the most vivid way. The best thing the BBC can do is just report.
But Roger, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. With the greatest of respect, the nitpicking that you just did then about who the BBC is very much demonstrates why the British public feel that it isn't spending the taxpayers' money appropriately. The idea that it's not the national broadcaster is we don't feel, the British people don't feel that is the case.
I don't think it's nitpicking. Well, I don't think it's nitpicking. You say the British public feels this. Actually, the British public fundamentally still supports and trusts the BBC News. Of course, it's not perfect and it makes mistakes. But the suggestion that the idea that it should represent Britain is a difficult one. The BBC should be reporting objectively and as far as it can. And it has a world service, and we want to be believed around the world, don't we, for what we say? And if people think it's just the BBC is the mouthpiece of government, then you're in trouble. You know, if you think world service is of value, that matters. It's not nitpicking.
OK, Roger, on the topic of nitpicking, if you don't think Hamas should be called terrorists, what would you call people who murder, decapitate, set fire, and then abduct and put into hostage people? What would you call them?
Hold on. We're talking about what the BBC should call them, not what I should call them.
No, you agree with the BBC's position. You made that clear. So I'm asking you, what would you call them if they're not terrorists? Words are important.
Those are acts of terror. As I do think the bombing that's going on in parts of Israel at the moment, with the thousands being killed and so on, are also, in their own way, acts of terror. I don't say I don't have any time for Hamas at all, or Hezbollah, or anything like that. But it doesn't help if you want to get people to believe what's going on. If you start adding those epithets and so on, you should say, simply report the atrocities that Hamas has committed. I mean, I think that... Sorry, Karen.
I was going to say, but what it does, Roger, because the BBC is not calling the events of October the 7th a terrorist attack, everybody's very quickly moving on now to look at the action that Israel is taking. If October the 7th is viewed globally as a terrorist attack, we would still be dissecting in much greater detail what happened that day and what a proportionate response might be. That's a separate conversation. But with the BBC describing them as, well, some governments, including the UK, call them a terrorist organisation, do you see it takes a lot of the it takes the power out of how awful that day was?
Well, I don't think so, but I'm happy. And by the way, the BBC has talked about terrorist acts. There's a difference between this.
Sorry, we're getting Roger back. Sorry, we have our next guest, Jim Dale, there waiting. I think we've had a technical issue. Sorry, Roger, carry on.
I was trying to say that. There's a difference between saying things a terrorist act, which clearly it was, and labelling the organisation terrorism. For me, the most important thing is we want people to believe the awful truth that reporters on the ground are revealing, and they should actually spell out increasingly detail what happened in Israel. But also they need, if they can get in, to report the deaths that are happening in Gaza. Now, it'll be very difficult for the Director General tonight, this afternoon. But I remember an occasion 40 years ago in the Falklands conflict, almost an identical situation. And the BBC chairman then was called George Howard, was a large man, and it was called an ox roasting. And it said there was deep entrails on the ground. So I think it'll be tough tonight.
Roger, what would you say to people out there who say the BBC aren't normally shy to kind of take a position on things like Brexit, things like climate change, but reluctant to take a position on calling Hamas terrorists, but quite quick to take a position on the bombing of the hospital car park as, attributable as the fault of Israel. Before that was so what I'm trying to get at here, is there a predisposition in the BBC mindset to, if you like, side with one side over the other?
No, and I could challenge all the things you're saying about Brexit and everything else because, dropping those in. I mean, direct question, there isn't a BBC mindset. Have you ever worked in the place?
Yes.
There are over 250 correspondents, so about 45, broadcasting in 45 languages, a whole raft of people. There's no general conspiracy. Of course, everybody has prejudices, and you've got to watch out for them. But the BBC just desperately tries to say what the truth is. When it gets it wrong, it says the New York Times, by the way, made that same mistake the BBC made, and the New York Times and the BBC apologized for that mistake. Well, they shouldn't make it again, but they apologized. Lots of other people made that mistake and haven't apologized. And by the way, what the BBC said was, according to Hamas, now, it didn't have an Israeli response at that time, and it should have been more skeptical. But it will inevitably make mistakes. The question is just to apologize quickly. And is this symptomatic of a worldview? It isn't. I don't believe that at all. Just like, on other subjects.
I think when it comes to the naming of Hamas as terrorists, that isn't just down to the individual producers or researchers of any particular output. That is the style guide of the British Broadcasting Corporation. So that can't be attributed to individuals. I've also worked at the BBC. My suggestion would also be that the BBC is employing a lot of people who are privately educated, who can afford to work as youngsters, are not getting paid a lot of money, they've bankrolled by the family to be there. And so, unfortunately, I do think there is a collective mindset often working within the offices of the BBC, which doesn't represent most people, actually, in this country. Would you suggest there's any sort of truth to that? There is a London, a very Westminster mindset, actually, so it becomes a bit of an echo chamber.
Right, well, someone from Carlisle who went to Liverpool University and didn't go to public school and went to state school, okay, I'll give you an answer, which is, I agree with a lot of that because there is a real danger now. I mean, it's like Victorian conditions where people are employed on short-term contracts, and you're true. The danger is, particularly in London, that only people with wealthy parents, get into the place. But what we've got to have that for, that's the reason for making sure the BBC comes from Salford, it leads everything else, and it makes it absolutely right that people like you should scrutinise what it does. But what you shouldn't do, really shouldn't do, is assume there's a worldview shared by everybody who works at the BBC. There are policies it has, and it's tried to explain this policy, and it's a difficult one. But let me make it clear. What happened clearly in Gaza, what happened in Israel was an appalling terrorist act. Totally disgusting. But it doesn't help it if the BBC isn't believed because it's calling that organization a terrorist organization. You want to be believed in Arab capitals, Arab countries. You want to believe in Gaza. You want people to acknowledge the reality of what Hamas is doing. And it's best done, in my view, and I think the BBC's view, for which I don't represent the BBC is simply reporting the facts. And the facts are horrible enough.
OK, Roger, we appreciate your experience, your insights. That's exactly what we do here on GB News. We show all sides of the story. BBC could try a little harder. But good to see you, Roger Bolton.